Okay, perfect. Well, thanks, folks. It's getting late in the day. I woke up at like 4:45 and got on a plane to get here, so I'm feeling it a little. So if it give me, be kind, right? There's that principle of charity we like to live by in philosophy. But thanks to Amandine and Veli and all the organizers, right? Spaces like this in philosophy are really hard to come by. So we just, we should be thankful. But okay, what am I doing in this talk today? So this laptop's in French. And well, let's see. No, but there are no arrows here. They're missing. Okay, I think I got it. Good. Right, the arrows are bilingual indeed. Okay. So what am I trying to do today? Well, one thing I'm trying to do is motivate that anti-critical race theory legislation of the kind that we've seen passed in the United States, in Florida and Iowa, by people like Rick DeSantis, who's the governor of Florida, right? That kind of legislation, I want to suggest, results in forms of hermeneutical injustice that are absent from the epistemology and the epistemic literature, epistemic injustice literature. And in motivating that, I'm going to try to describe to you or make plausible something I'm calling historical hermeneutical injustice. And a basic feature of historical hermeneutical injustice I'll try to convince you of is that historical persons from the past who are no longer with us, from hundreds of years ago or whatever, they can suffer hermeneutical injustice. And some people have not liked this idea because people think only extant persons can suffer some kind of injustice. So I'm going to try to convince you of that. And the second kind of phenomenon that I'm going to describe is what I call background fact hermeneutical injustice, for the lack of a catchy title. So maybe you all can help me there. And in describing this, I'm going to motivate that facts, as opposed to concepts, can serve as hermeneutical resources. And for those who know the epistemic injustice literature, concepts have been like central in the debate. So I want to shift our attention to other things that can serve as hermeneutical or interpretive resources, right? So if I've done that, then I feel like I've at least done something today, okay? And in doing this, right, and shifting us to facts, really what I'm shifting us to is that information, understanding, the epistemic state of understanding, and even knowledge can serve as hermeneutical resources or interpretive resources in ways that concepts can, right? But in importantly different ways. Okay, so let me give you a case. So Greg Wickenkamp was a third grade history teacher in Iowa. And in Iowa, they passed a law not too long ago that made it illegal to teach children about systemic injustice. And the basic point of that law is that it's illegal to teach children material that makes them feel bad about their identity, right? Right, brilliant law. And so Greg Wickenkamp was teaching a module or section on chattel slavery in the United States, as he well should. And in teaching that, he mentioned that chattel slavery is immoral. And it turns out one of the children went back to their parents and said, I feel bad. And the parent complained, and this got back to him. And then he reached out to the school administrator to make sure that he could permissibly teach his students that chattel slavery was or is immoral, right? That moral fact, that is, right? That fact. And it turns out that the administrator was unsure, and really you could go and watch the Zoom interview, the Zoom call he has with the administrator in a Washington Post article, where the administrator, and she seems nice enough, right? She's just there kind of as a bureaucrat enforcing some law she probably didn't endorse. But she says, yeah, I don't think you can teach just according to the law. So Greg Wickenkamp actually quits his job, right? He says, if I can't teach children that chattel slavery is immoral, then I'm, as a history teacher, then I'm in the wrong business. And he's no longer a history teacher. And that's so much the worse for Iowa and what those students are going to be introduced to as far as information, true information, that chattel slavery is immoral or was immoral. in the United States, right? So this is just a piece of the kind of legislation that's been passed, as I mentioned, in Florida, Arizona, and other states. And this is also of a piece with the general poor informing of students of these kinds of facts we've had in the US. And the little time I've been in Canada, it's true in Canada too. Right, so, but I'm focusing on this anti-critical race theory legislation because this legislation is really up front and center and focusing on facts and history. And I think it's important. And often in philosophy, we don't focus on history enough, right? Okay. So I think this example and anti-critical race theory legislation and laws in general across the US put into view two kinds of hermeneutical injustice. What I'm calling, and already mentioned, historical hermeneutical injustice, where someone from the past who's trying to present and communicate their experience of injustice present suffers an injustice and not being able to communicate that experience. And then background fact hermeneutical injustice, which I'll get to in a moment. But let me give you the basic argument of my talk, of this paper. And the first premise of this basic argument is that anti-critical race theory laws and legislation are a form of hermeneutical marginalization. And the basic idea that hermeneutical marginalization points to, and here I'm just following Miranda Fricker, is that we can be, non-dominant groups can be disadvantaged in society in terms of their ability to contribute to the ideas and interpretive resources that we share across society. Right, and I'll come back to that. But that's the first premise, right? Anti-critical race theory laws are a form of hermeneutical marginalization. It's a way of favoring the dominant group over the non-dominant group in terms of interpretive resources. And when I use the term hermeneutical, I just mean interpretive, okay? For any Gadamerarians in the audience, because I did give this talk to a bunch of Gadamerarians. They were not happy about me using the word hermeneutical. Okay, so the second premise in this argument is that this form of hermeneutical marginalization results in historical persons suffering hermeneutical injustice, right? Persons from the past. The third premise in this argument is that this kind of hermeneutical marginalization, that is the kind that obtains when we have anti-critical race theory laws, result in instances of hermeneutical injustice that obtain because of the absence of facts, right? Qua hermeneutical resource, understood as a hermeneutical resource or an interpretive resource. And I think if these premises are good, I think I can conclude that anti-critical race theory laws result in hermeneutical injustice cases where subjects suffer hermeneutical injustice. Where historical subjects suffer hermeneutical injustice, and cases of hermeneutical injustice that obtain because of the absence of facts, qua hermeneutical resource. And I should say here, actually, just a little bit about, I'm trying to go back, that's not working, so I'll leave it there. Most folks in this audience will know, but for those who aren't paying too close attention to the US, and good for you, the conservatives who are passing this legislation don't care about critical race theory, right? They don't care about Derek Bell. They don't care about Kimberly Crenshaw. They just care about particular true facts about how things went in terms of race relations and power relations not being taught to the dominant group because it upsets their self-concept. That's kind of how I think about it. Where the self-concept is like, oh, well, we deserve our place and station in society, something like that. But okay, let me just say a little bit about hermeneutical injustice. And I'm kind of inspired by the talk on decolonial epistemology. And instead of using, as I often do, the Carmita Wood case that features centrally in the literature, I'll give you like a personal case of hermeneutical injustice. So a few weeks ago, I was at a talk at at Northwestern University, which was focused on incarcerated persons and their experience and the injustices that they suffer. And a person in the audience, it turned out, had spent a lot of time in New York. He was from the South Bronx, I was from Queens. And then we kind of like, a lot of like, we realized we understood each other. We were using shorthand like to describe our experiences. So, you know, like he understood under the Rudolph Giuliani area in New York City, there were what we called paddy wagons, which were just like wagons that the police had and went out and picked up kids who were like smoking or drinking on their stoop and just shoveled them into jail for a night or two, right? Like that was common practice. And then he said something, which he used the acronym TNT, which meant Tuesdays and Thursdays, which were the days that, because of the quota system that Giuliani put in place, meant that the police went out with extra vigor and just picked up anybody for almost any reason, and you'd have to spend the weekend in jail, right? And this happened to me, this happened to him, and this person had was incarcerated for many years, so he knew a lot more about the carceral system than I. But we were able to get on. And then I realized when I mentioned TNT and Tuesdays and Thursdays, a lot of the things that we were taking just for granted, the people in the audience didn't know what we were talking. I had to like take great pains to explain what I was talking about, as I just did to you all. I couldn't just mention TNT and I couldn't mention whatever. So that, I think, is an example of hermeneutical injustice. Because here I am, it's going to be a lot more difficult for me to explain what I went through in the Rudolph Giuliani era, right, being shoveled into paddy wagons, than, and why is that? Because you all don't have this concept. And why don't you have this concept TNT or whatever other concepts I could invoke that have to do with the Rudolph Giuliani area in New York City as far as policing? Well, it's because Black and Latinx folks and low-income folks are not the folks who control what ideas we share in North America about policing, right? So I take that to be an example of hermeneutical injustice, right? At least 2 weeks ago at Northwestern, because it was just harder for me to explain. And yet, notice, this case differs importantly from the Carmita Wood case in some ways, because me and his name was George Chochos. You could look him up. He's a brilliant guy. He's doing a PhD in theology at Georgetown. He understood what I was talking about. We shared a hermeneutical resource that the not dominant group didn't share. So that is a case of hermeneutical injustice, I take. Okay. And that involved, as I just explained, hermeneutical marginalization, right? Because, you know, Dominicans, Puerto Ricans, and Black folks in New York just don't control the ideas that people share about policing in North America. But okay, hermeneutical marginalization involves at least two kinds of harms, right? What has been referred to as the cognitive harm. So that's the harm that Miranda Fricker at least was interpreted as presenting initially in the literature, where someone lacks ideas, and the lack of ideas prevents them from actually fully understanding what the injustice that they underwent or experienced, right? And then the introduction of that idea will help them understand more fully the injustice or injustice that they suffered. Then there's the communicative harm, right? That's a separate one, I think, but still a hermeneutical injustice. That's the one I just referred to, right? I can communicate my experience to you all. I know perfectly well what happened, right? I understand it fully, I think, or at least pretty well. And so there are two different kinds of harms. I'm going to be focusing on the communicative harm, okay? Right. So what's this historical hermeneutical injustice phenomenon? Well, I think anti-critical race theory legislation causes or is a form of hermeneutical marginalization. I'm not sure to say cause or is, but whatever. And let me give you a case of historical hermeneutical injustice. So the Mexica are who we now call the Aztec. The Mexica didn't call themselves the Aztec. That's a term that, like, you know, was developed in Mexico or in the Americas in the 1800s, right? So the Mexica are the Aztecs for our purposes. And as we probably all know, in 1519 and 1520, Cortez got going more or less a genocide across the Americas. And one thing people don't realize is that the Mexica were a fully literate people. To this day, you can pick up a book about the Mexica and read that they didn't have language like the Mayans. Not true. Turns out what we thought were pictographs are actually more just like the Mayan script that have full-on phonemes and syllables, and they had writing. And because they had writing, they had scribes. And the scribes picked up Latin very quickly because they were literate and they were scribes, right? So we have these firsthand accounts from these scribes of the sacking and the kind of extinguishing really of Tenochtitlan society, which is now modern day Mexico City. And a scribe said this, and I'll just read this. Along the roads, the splintered javelins lie. Scalps are strewn around. Roofless are the houses and bright red their walls. Vermin swarm in the streets and in the squares, and the walls are smeared with splattered brains. Red flow the waters as if they were dyed, and when we drink them, it is as if we were drinking saltpeter. So that I take is a Mexica person's, in this case a scribe's, first personal account. I take it he's trying to communicate his understanding of an injustice that he suffered, at least in some measure, right? Now, if you don't have certain information, us now, here in the present, when this understanding won't have as much uptake as it can, and notice understanding can come in degrees as opposed to knowledge, at least the way epistemologists tend to think of knowledge. So if you don't know that, say, facts like that in the 1500s, historians now estimate up to 100 million indigenous persons died as a result of the conquest, then you may not have a sense of like the world historical event that took place, and that what this scribe is describing, right? You need background and commitment, cognitive commitment to antecedent information to have full uptake, or at least as full uptake as you could have of the understanding that this scribe is communicating. So now what I've just described to you is there's a person in the past, a non-dominant group member, who's trying to communicate his experience of injustice to us in the present. And guess what? Things like legislation passed in Arizona that prevent like Chicano studies, things like that will tend to prevent people from knowing facts like that 100 million indigenous persons died as a result of the conquest. Thus, we will not have full uptake. And I teach Latin American philosophy at least, once a year, and invariably nobody knows this fact. I mean, I really didn't know this fact until I got to college, that 100 million, I knew some people died. But we know, and rightfully, that there were 6 million or so Jewish folks who died in the Holocaust. But here in the Americas, we had a genocide, and we don't know that up to 100 million, people died. And that's just in the 1500s. So facts like those, I say, can serve as hermeneutical resources, such that the Mexica scribe, who's no longer with us, suffers a hermeneutical injustice, right? Now, some people may not like this. They're like, oh, you really need to be around to suffer an injustice. And I've always had this intuition, like, when I read about what happened in Central America and all the Mayan peoples who were in towns and villages that were just exterminated by US-funded military groups, like how many of those accounts we'll never hear? And that seems like an injustice that we can't even have uptake of those, right? Or if there is some uptake that could be had, if we're lacking facts and don't have full uptake of those, our understanding of those events. So to me, it's always kind of been obvious, but I realize it's not obvious. So I'm going to try to say something to motivate this idea that past persons can suffer hermeneutical injustice. So they can suffer hermeneutical injustice, past persons can, because they can have an interest or even intend that their understanding have uptake with future persons. So Samuel Scheffler wrote a book about what he called death in the afterlife. And there's a lot of things he says in that book, but one thing he says, which I think is right, is that the things that we're engaging in right now, writing articles, maybe giving talks, making music, all these kinds of creative endeavors and works have meaning in large measure, if not entirely, because, I don't know about entirely, but in large measure because we are in conversation with future generations. And he presents a case. He says, imagine we know for certain that a catastrophe will afflict Earth and there will be no future generations. He says people are probably going to stop submitting to whatever your favorite journal is, right? People are not going to be writing novels, right? Why? Because it would seem meaningless, right? You're not going to try to write, that really dope album and get it out there. No, you're not, because it's part of what we're trying to do is be in conversation with people in the future. So I thought that was suggestive. And then Jennifer Lackey talks about this right to be known. And the right to be known involves the right of a subject who suffered injustice or oppression to be giver of knowledge to others about their own experience. And here she developed this idea in her dealings and creating a prison education program at Northwestern University in the, at least at first in the state of Illinois. And she just encountered all these people who weren't known and had a right to be known, where that involves people bearing witness, right? So satisfying this right involves that a subject gives knowledge of their experience, but importantly, that an audience bears witness. That's like the crucial piece of this right to be known. And I want to suggest that historical hermeneutical injustice can suffice for violation of this right, Because look, think about the Mashika case. In the Mashika case, this person suffered a grave injustice. If Jennifer Lackey's right, then that generates a right for this scribe for us to bear witness, and we're not bearing witness if we don't have uptake because we lack the requisite facts such that we could have uptake or understand his experience fully. Right, and I think also this one way of getting at this is when we're out on the streets and chanting "say their name" vis-a-vis George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and too many other people. I think in some measure we're kind of harping on this point, right? George Floyd has a right to be known. Breonna Taylor has a right to be known. Ahmaud Arbery has a right to be known. But if you don't like this idea that a deceased person can suffer this kind of injustice, then I do think we can think about present persons. So in the Mashika case, there are 2.5 million Nahuatl people who still speak Nahuatl, the language, in Mexico. And when we don't have uptake of one of their ancestors' experience, and thus that group's experience, we fail to know them as a group. So I think this can be, we can kind of ground this two ways, right? We can think of this historical hermeneutical injustice two ways, in terms of an individual who belongs to a particular group who suffers an injustice, or we can ground it in the kind of extant group now. We could go both ways, or maybe they overlap. I'm not sure about this point. Okay, let me say a little bit about background fact hermeneutical injustice. So this is the second phenomenon that I'm pointing to that I think the anti-critical race theory legislation kind of puts into view. So as I mentioned, facts, I think, can serve as hermeneutical resources as opposed to concepts. And anti-critical race theory legislation depresses these facts, the presence of these facts, right? When Greg Wickenkamp isn't in class and you have some other person who's going to fall in line with the legislation, then you're going to have less of these facts, right? So if a subject can't communicate understanding of their experience of injustice because of anti-critical race theory laws, because anti-critical race theory laws preclude facts or understood as a hermeneutical resource, then background fact hermeneutical injustice obtains, because you have hermeneutical injustice not in virtue of a concept, but in virtue of a fact. That is the absence of a fact. Let me give you a sense of how I'm thinking about how this may go without talking about hermeneutical injustice exactly. So take let's imagine Judelki is a astrophysicist, and she's giving her talk here in Montreal to a group of astrophysicists. And her talk's about black holes and the natural laws that govern them. And she's giving the talk naturally to an audience of astrophysicists. And what do they have? They have cognitive commitment to related facts. Like if she was giving a talk to us, it may not have uptake, her talk, right? Maybe some of you have really deep astrophysical knowledge, but let's suppose you don't. So she successfully gets this new view she has about black holes has uptake because her audience is what Stephen Grimm calls primed, epistemically primed. They have a rich network of understanding in which to her understanding that she's developed slots into such that they can have uptake of it. That's the idea. Right, so understanding information can require antecedent cognitive commitment to distinct but related information. That's kind of the point. But let me give you a case. Now, there's audio here. It's like 50-50 that this is going to work, folks. So let's see. Okay, so I take that to be an example of James Baldwin conveying his experience of dealing with the police in Harlem and his experience as a Black person in the US, right? And vis-a-vis its lack of democracy. I have other slides, but you know what? I think I got out the basic points, but let me just say one last thing. So here in the James Baldwin case, right, his audience is going to, I think, right, certainly when this aired, you know, back in the 1960s, it probably didn't have a lot of uptake for lots of reasons having to do with psychological attitudes. But I think at least one reason we can point to is that his audience just lacked a lot of the relevant information that they would need such that they would have uptake and understand and fully receive the understanding he's communicating about his experience of injustice. So there they lack facts, and thus James Baldwin experiences what I call background fact hermeneutical injustice. But notice, James Baldwin, unfortunately, is not with us anymore. So he might also be experiencing historical hermeneutical injustice. So the two can kind of overlap. So I think this is a case where we have both. And I will just stop there. Thank you.